Is music present in every culture that we know of on Earth? I want to ask you about goosebumps or gooseflesh. How would you define music? I'm curious about your thoughts on AI in this.
And what's interesting is for those pieces of music that people judge as being human generated, you see more activity in parts of the brain that are important for social cognition.
Wow. Hello and welcome to AnthroTalk, the podcast about anthropology and humanity. I'm your host, Jake Selesky, and with me today I have Professor Petr Janata. Petr Janata is a professor at the University of California at Davis. To quote the UC Davis website, he's a cognitive neuroscientist studying the psychology and neuroscience of music, is especially interested in the basic psychological and neuromechanisms that underlie strong experiences that people have with music, such as music-evoked remembering or feeling in the groove. That's all great, and on top of that, he's a former professor of mine, twice actually. He somehow found it in his heart to answer my questions about psychology one more time. Professor Janata, welcome to AnthroTalk.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Yeah, so you study music and psychology of music. I think it might be good to start out with a definition of what music is. Of course, definitions are tough. I mean, if you want to define a chair, you could say a chair is four legs, this thing you sit on, but that's also the definition of a horse. So for the sake of just a conversational definition, how would you define music?
Well, as you note, it's a pretty challenging thing to define. I tend to think of it as organized sound. So it can really be fairly simple, kind of repetitive sequences of some sound, basic rhythms, or it can be full-on complex symphonies and what have you. But it's really ways of organizing our auditory environments.
That makes sense, yeah. And that kind of is very similar to kind of what language is too, at a different level. So what would you say like the difference between language and music? Because some languages are very musical. I mean, Mandarin Chinese has 4 tones. I believe Cantonese has 6. Vietnamese might have like 8. I'm not sure how many, but very tonal languages. Even our language, we use intonations for questions, and we go up and down, and we have beats and rhythms. So, well, how do you distinguish language and music then?
Yeah, well, I think it's I distinguish them in terms of their primary roles. So language very much involved to convey meaning, with varying degrees of precision, but it's really all about communicating meaning, between individuals. And that's not to say that music doesn't have meaning, but I think most people regard music as having emotional meaning. It can also serve in social contexts to, help with social bonding or, things like that. So it carries, it's meaningful in that regard, but it's not as transactional as language is in terms of, conveying meaning.
Mm. So it sounds like the intended meaning behind it is kind of what distinguishes them, whereas music is kind of like this, as Steven Pinker said, like auditory cheesecake, whereas language can be more of like a very functional thing like this right now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can, with language, you can say, I need to go to the store and, buy some eggs and milk. Very easy to do that, very concisely and compactly. One would really struggle to do that through music.
True. Unless you're singing some ancient epic like in Greece, singing the Fall of Troy.
Right.
But yeah.
Well, but in that regard, I mean, it's true that, before, if one considers oral histories and the transmission of oral histories, that, one of the ways to do that is actually through song. So it's sort of using music as a vehicle on which to place, words and sentences, things like that, all the language. and where the music may actually help with the memory for what one is trying to communicate linguistically. So there's, people tend to get melodies and music stuck in their minds, and I think that speaks to the sort of spontaneous rehearsal or replay mechanism for music, which, when associated with other things, can possibly help with retention of that information too, like epic novels.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, because it's hard to imagine, these like thick novels, Beowulf, Gilgamesh, The Fall of Troy, all that stuff. People just recited them, over and over again. There's cool stuff I've read also about how they used to use kind of like visuals to remember that, like imagine they're going through a place. But yeah, it's a very interesting association of memory and music. Is there any association between personality traits and people remembering or liking certain types of music? Or is it mostly just kind of how you grew up or something else?
Well, it's going to be a combination of those things. So we tend to prefer things we're familiar with. And so if, there's particular music that we're hearing when we're growing up, we'll certainly, it'll factor, prominently for us. But then there's also research on showing that people with certain personality traits tend to prefer certain genres of music more. So it's certainly the case that there are various musical preferences that people have. And indeed, some of those do seem to be motivated by personality traits. In particular, openness to new experiences, or extroversion. So people who are more extroverted, tend to like higher energy music. So one does find those associations, though they don't explain everything about preferences.
Of course, yeah. It's easy to imagine, an extroverted college student at a rave listening to EDM, and a kind of more quiet, like in the country guy in his truck listening to, country music. So maybe the stereotypes are somewhat true, but of course there's always variations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, they are. I mean, so much of it's driven by our environments that we're in, what we're exposed to. But then, to the extent that people vary sort of in their energy levels, or whether, they're more introspective or, extroverted or what have you, then, that's likely to translate to the types of activities they engage in, or, the kind of music soundtracks that they want to have accompanying such activities. So I think it all kind of ends up combining.
Yeah, it all impacts each other. To what extent does maybe pure repetition impact that? Because my dad has a theory that people's music taste is just kind of like what they grew up hearing, what they hear over and over again. Songs on the radio becoming popular because people hear them over and over again. Songs your friends listen to, you liking because you hear them over and over. To what extent does like just maybe pure repetition impact people's liking of music?
So it does have an effect. I think many people have had the experience where they'll hear a piece of music once, that maybe a friend told them, oh yeah, this is really cool, and you hear it the first time, and you're like, I don't know that I really like it, but then you give it a second or third listen, and it just grows on you over time. Maybe that's because you're discovering new things in it. You're hearing things you didn't hear before. So certainly it's the case that with added repetitions, people's liking for things, not only music but in general, will increase. But after, say, 15 repetitions or so, things will actually tend to plateau and may even go the other direction, right? So it's definitely possible to over consume something, right? Sort of tire of it for a while, and so music is no different.
Yeah, there's a lot of people say songs are overplayed on the radio and stuff like that. Overplayed on TikTok now, I guess you would say, more so. But yeah, getting more into why people like music, I want to ask you about goosebumps or goose flesh. I've had experience while listening to music. I've been, wow, got shivers down my spine, that kind of thing. I'm sure it's universal. What kind of is the cause of that? Because I imagine like the evolutionary cause purely of goosebumps is to raise fur, right? We don't have fur anymore, but it was to raise fur, make us more scared of predators, I believe. So what does like that tie of being more aggressive and pushing off predators have to do with us liking a Beatles song, for example?
Yeah, so David Huron, music psychologist, has a nice book and nice account of all of this, and it's it has a lot to do with how music plays on our expectations, and and the fact that our brains serve this function of predicting what's going to happen in our environments next, and when something unexpected happens, they have to figure out, okay, well, what just happened, right? So that we can update our models of how the environment behaves and be better prepared next time, if you will. And so music, similarly, you can create these expectations and violate them or fulfill them. And so the idea is that when something unexpected happens, that it signals a change in the environment that's potentially threatening, right? So sort of the violation of expectations is also tied into fear responses, and that kind of responding is when you get piloerection, so the hair is raising on end, and it's just a very sort of quick and automatic system. And so by having sudden changes in music, violating our expectations, it can induce that kind of response. But because we're in a safe context, right, there's no scary animal coming to eat us, or nothing crashing through the forest to get us. We can find that kind of experience pleasurable. Probably the best analogy is, people liking horror movies.
I was going to bring it up, yeah.
Which I personally, I just can't deal with them. But that's how you explain why those are so popular, right? It's because you can experience these scary things in an environment that 99.9% of the time is actually safe, and thereby it ends up becoming pleasurable.
Maybe it's like spicy food, perhaps, too, It's a painful reaction, but you're totally fine.
Yeah, exactly. So, so it's really about that context being a safe context for us to then experience things that are perhaps a bit uncomfortable in. Mm-hmm. So that's that's one account of how one arrives at chills being a pleasurable experience.
So it's being a pleasurable experience because it's an unexpected thing, but we're in like a safe environment, so we should enjoy it. We're not being harmed by it.
Yeah. But there are other things. It's really a much more nuanced thing, right? So sometimes one can get chills even if you have an epiphany, or someone says something that really strikes true, or is really profound or something like that. So in such cases, one can also experience the chill, but I think it's harder to, lay that feared narrative, on top of that situation. So I think there's still quite a bit to be understood about how, things that sort of engage us intellectually, because with music, it can be that too, right? So it's some little particular configuration of sounds or some particular passage, or maybe, a vocalist's voice, or, maybe even a short phrase or something like that, right? That somehow seems very poignant to us, and that can sort of release that experience of the chill. So that's a little bit of a different account than the pure, violating expectancies in a safe environment sort of account.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about the similarities to getting chills with the speech of maybe a politician you like. We're talking about all this great stuff they want to do, and you get chills because think about the future and how good it could be. Maybe it's a similar experience with that with music.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So in the music world, I mean, people argue about music and emotion and its capacity to elicit specific emotions, or do we just perceive that there are emotions in the music? But some psychologists regard the experiencing of awe with music as being one of those emotions that music really does induce. And so that experience of awe is very often associated with the experiencing of chills also.
Mm. Yeah, it's very true. Wow, it's a good point about the feeling of awe with music, because there's so many different roads you could go down with that. I think that I want to ask you a little more about awe in the context of kind of culture. So in the West, generally major chords are considered to be more happy and upbeat, but from what I remember you telling in class, that's not universal. I believe maybe the example is Balinese funeral music sounded sad to us when we played it in class, but to them it's very happy and upbeat. So I'm curious, or I may have got the culture wrong, but I'm curious, is there a reason why,
Excuse me.
Is there a reason why those major chords are seen as one way in the West and a different way in other cultures?
Yeah, so I mean, there's increasing evidence that how we perceive particular sounds that are being used in a musical system, so major chords or major scales, what have you, that it's really through the cultural associations that we make with those, again, in social contexts, right? So if we're hearing, upbeat major mode music in contexts where people are dancing and laughing and smiling, and then we're going to form the associations between those musical characteristics and those emotional expressions. And so in Western tonal music, indeed, the associations tend to form along the major is happy, minor is sad. I mean, probably the most consistently universal impact of music on emotion would have to do with arousal and tempo. So definitely music that's at a faster tempo is going to be more arousing than music that's at a slower tempo. And that seems to be fairly uniformly preserved. But then things having to do with pitch and tonality, things like that, there's more variability across cultures and how those are used and what emotional connotations they have.
That makes sense. Is maybe one reason why tempo is so associated with being excited because kind of tempo signifies a faster beat, which makes us want to like tap our feet more and move more and get excited more? Or is that too maybe simple of an explanation for it?
Yeah, it essentially is a call to action, at faster rates. Heart rate also adapts with tempo. So, sort of a fairly loud, faster tempo stimulus will, in fact, sort of increased arousal, which is associated with increased heart rate, right? So again, those things all hang together in that way.
Yeah, it's really cool to study the cultural differences of music, even different instruments and the similarities, I mean. But I want to ask, is music present in every culture that we know of on Earth, or some cultures that don't seem to have any music?
Yeah, so as far as people can tell, music in some form exists in all cultures that have, known cultures that have been examined. This has been done in the context of song. And so, in a survey of a large number, a few dozen indigenous cultures that are still around, they all have song, and where song can then serve various functions. So often it has to do with religious functions. So it's sort of one dimension to it. Other dimensions have to do with, say, dancing versus not dancing, and then another one has these social, positive, emotional aspects to it.
Yeah, and it makes sense. Music serves a lot of purposes, like religious, maybe religious songs and churches, Catholic churches being very high pitched and very echoic and signify maybe greatness and eternality. Maybe farm workers singing songs can signify, unity, working together. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So if music is a cultural universal as far as we know, does that mean that and language also seems to be a cultural universal? Every culture seems to have language. Does that mean that language and music probably coexisted or co-evolved together, or is that a bit more difficult to know?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, right? Whenever
you weren't there for me.
Back, yeah, exactly. I have all this gray hair. I might look like it, but
I'm kidding.
Wasn't there. Yeah, so I mean, so various people have, theorized about this, and it kind of gets back to the question you asked at the beginning, what are some of the differences between music and language? And so, I think a theory that makes a lot of sense is that language and music both had a common ancestor at one point. Some people have called it Musi language, where really what you're trying to do in utilizing your vocal tract and needing to interact with other members of your group, your tribe, what have you, in various contexts, you want to have a way of being able to signify things through some sort of emotional vocalization. Signify the presence of danger, signify the presence of success, try to calm someone down, what have you. And so doing that through emotional vocalizations makes a lot of sense. And you don't necessarily at that point need to have, fully formed propositional language. You don't need to have a label for absolutely everything in order to be able to do that. But what you do end up with is a way of sort of modulating emotion through pitch, which then in, modern day language that, as you noted, it's present in tonal languages where it's used very subtly to then actually affect shape meaning, but more broadly, it's also present in prosody, right? So the emotional qualities we give to our statements or questions. And so the idea is that, way long ago, 50, 100,000 years ago, even longer, that basically there was pressure on this music language system to become more and more specific, to then have signifiers for particular objects in the environment, or to signify particular actions, right? So there's a lot of need for that. But at the same time, you want some way of structuring sound, in social contexts, or to, shape the emotional state of a group of people or of individuals. So there's really this need for two completely different things that you're doing with sound. And so then all of a sudden you have evolutionary pressure both to develop, a language system and to also, evolve a musical system. So, to me, that kind of account makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about it and the history of it. And I wonder if in 50,000 years from now, will be a third kind of communication. Who knows? I mean, I'm sure if you asked, ancient people 100,000 years ago, if music and language would be different one day, they might be confused what you meant by that. So who knows where it'll be.
Well, they probably wouldn't. Right. I mean, they probably wouldn't even have known how to think about the question. Right? Because at that point, that's sort of all there is, right? So there isn't really that wherewithal, the capacity to think about those things. But to your point, it is interesting to sort of contemplate, how music and language might continue to evolve, or whether there's some other, system of vocalizations, that may somehow combine the two in unique ways that we haven't really experienced yet today, to date. So.
Yeah, well, this will go up later, but in The Last of Us, which is a TV show about the apocalypse and zombies, in season 2, episode 3, I'm not spoiling it for you, am I?
No,
Okay.
I'm neither into horror nor zombies too much, yeah. So.
But there's this culture that has language as we do, but also they kind of travel long distances, and they're apart from each other sometimes. So there's a system of whistling where they use different whistling noises, and then these noises would just sound like almost like normal bird sounds to us. Listen to them like, oh, they're saying they're 50 miles away and we're safe, but we need to hurry up now. So maybe expand on things like that. I mean, the click language, is it the Khoisan people, I forget, of Africa, is also a bit different than languages we have now. But yeah, the future is interesting.
Yeah, I think one of my colleagues here, David Carina, I think he's a linguist. And for a time, I think he was studying people in the Canary Islands who use the systems of whistling. Because like you said, that carries, across hillsides and, valleys and stuff like that. So it's a way of communicating at distance.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So keeping on the theme of the future, I'm curious about your thoughts on AI in this. I mean, of course, in general, it's hard to know what effect AI will have. I mean, if you ask someone 10 years ago what the future was, they would say big data, perhaps. If you ask someone 100 years ago what the future is, they say, steam locomotives, like, we can never get past this. So there's always a maybe a mindset of what's happening in our time is the future and will change everything. But even given that, I'm curious on your thoughts on AI and music and how it's going to impact it. I mean, we already have computer programs like FL Studio and GarageBand. We can make music on your computer. We have AutoTune, which can obviously change notes of music. So we've had an interaction of music and computers for quite a while now. But I'm curious what your thoughts on AI's impact on music are. Do you think that if maybe if someone thinks that music is just math, which is certainly an idea, because music is so math heavy, then perhaps an algorithm could create the mathematically most pleasing song. But in general, I'm just curious about your thoughts on the future of AI in music, knowing your understanding of psychology of music.
Yeah, well, I think that probably the most likely evolution of applications we'll see in the near term, it all again has to do with music recommendation, right? So companies like Spotify or Pandora, it's all about like giving you what you want to hear in the moment, right? And that's not an easy problem because people differ in what they want to be consuming as music in any given moment. Sometimes they just want silence, So I think that, but I do think that most of the time people want to be listening to something that is congruous with the emotional state or psychological state they want to be in, right? So people like create playlists for doing various things, studying, working out, cooking, what have you. And it's so presumably the music they're putting on those playlists sort of helps them be in the psychological state they want to be in. So I think where some of the AI comes in then, could be in stuff that helps engage the person's emotional state in the moment, right? Whether it's through maybe facial expressions or, how they're walking or moving about or, perhaps combined with the context of where they are, right? So it's really trying to make inferences about a person's psychological state and then understanding what music to play them to sort of move them toward or along in their psychological state. And it may be even, music that's composed on the fly, right? It may not, it's, I know that, sometimes I'll have earworms for specific pieces of music. Other times I'm just like improvising some sort of jam, and how great would it be if all of a sudden, there were other instruments jamming along, right? So I didn't have to cover all the parts and I can just be having, this virtual jam in my mind, alongside this music that's being created, in that moment. So I guess in that regard, this is something people have been trying to do for a while now, but it's using EEG or other types of sort of biological measures to actually compose music, in the moment. So I think that there, and again, and this whole trying to read a person's psychological state and use that either to select existing music or compose music, I think that's probably where AI ends up meeting up with music.
So maybe like generating a custom playlist, maybe based on an algorithm of your mood, and maybe also putting generating music in there. When you said biometrics and EEG, what I immediately thought of is the Meta Ray-Ban glasses, or Meta Ray-Ban glasses, the ones that were released, the Orion ones that were like the augmented reality. You just put them on, you see a screen in front of you. If you remember, they had a bracelet that came with it that measured kind of your electrical signals to know when you're tapping. Mm-hmm. So maybe they could use that same band to know your kind of maybe heartbeat and kind of your arousal state, to know kind of what mood you're in. I know other watches use like your perspiration to know how you're feeling, and a combination of like scanning your environment to have an always on playlist for you based on your mood. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's certainly interesting to think about. It's very hard to know where it'll go because, of course, I think we're in a big, I don't want to say bubble because that implies it's going to pop, but we're in a very highly hyped up AI moment right now. So yeah, it's interesting to hear that where you think it's going to go.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the large language models right now, they they're trained on this principle of predicting, what word's going to come next. And so if you have that, good way of predicting, then you have a way of, generating what's going to come next because, it's the thing you would have predicted. And so what they do is they're really great at extracting, various statistical regularities that are, present in some huge corpus of input. And so, similarly with music, I mean, the rules of music in any particular system, but the most studied has certainly been Western tonal music. There are rules for how to compose and blah, 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 and, chord sequences and, things like that. And so in that sense, it's a statistical thing that can be learned and that can then be emulated. And so I think actually, this is an interesting thing. I hadn't thought about it in this way, but, one of the problems for the large language models is, they just make stuff up. So it's the hallucination problem. With music, that may not matter so much.
Oh, true.
Right? Because it gets back again to the thing, with music, you're not necessarily trying to convey a precise message, right? So it doesn't matter if you get the words wrong necessarily. What you're doing is you're creating this soundscape for a person, and so you can create a whole bunch of really similar kinds of soundscapes that are still different from each other and interesting in that regard. But they're not really constrained by, veridical truth. So in some sense, those probabilistic models may, for music generation, that's probably have greater success there in the long run than they do for other tasks where just on a daily basis they're shown to fall short. I mean, they don't reason. That's they don't really think. They're just sort of generating likely things without, mechanisms for checking. Does this make sense logically? But yeah, music doesn't necessarily have all those same constraints. So it could be quite useful there.
Yeah, that reminds me of there was a bit of a minor scandal a while ago where lo-fi music, the lo-fi hip-hop chill beats music, there was a channel that was using AI to make a lot of lo-fi music, and people found out and got upset about it. But it's really hard to tell with that because the lo-fi music on YouTube is very chill. You can almost not even hear some of the sounds sometimes, and it's also quite improvised. So maybe AI has application there, and I mean, clearly it does. These videos got millions of views. So
so that's an interesting thing, right? I guess it gets back to the culture thing, and there have in fact been some neuroimaging studies done on this where you give people pieces of music, and this is actually done using tone row music, so like Anton Weber and then Schoenberg and folks like that. So piece of music, and you have people judge whether they're computer generated or human generated, right? In fact, they're all human generated, but some of them people, judge as sounding computer generated, others as human generated. And what's interesting is for those pieces of music that people judge as being human generated, you see more activity in parts of the brain that are important for social cognition.
Wow.
And people will also say they like the human generated music more, right, than what they rated as computer generated. Again, all of it's human generated, right? So I think that there's sort of a aesthetic and moralistic overlay that we put on a lot of music, right? Where we might be outraged that a piece of music was, written by an algorithm, whereas you could, take the same piece of music, say that it was written by a human, all of a sudden we'd love it, right? So that's really doesn't have as much to do with the music itself anymore as it does with, all the social stuff that we lay on top of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it brings up a good point. I mean, I'm pretty sure I remember reading that when in the West, when like a lot more singers started singing over classical music, there was outrage because it was believed that, oh, you just play instruments there, you don't sing over that in some context. So you're right, there's definitely a moralistic overtone we add to all this. And it's a very interesting time right now in the history books we've written about our decisions we make right now, that we make, just you and I. So it's been great having you on the podcast. We're nearing the end of the time. I wanted to go a bit more into the culture of music. Music is constantly evolving, like culture is. And do you have any predictions for where music will go in the next few decades? It's hard to know. We talk about AI with music, eventually AI making music, AI helping music. What about any other trends in music that you've seen or observed, even smaller trends, like year to year?
Yeah, I wouldn't actually claim to be an expert in music trends or popular music or anything like that. I think what's really interesting, though, is how the way that we consume music now and the fact that so much of it is available to us so much of the time, and it's really pretty arbitrary. So what that means is that, whereas 30 years ago, you'd have a generation of people growing up with exactly the same music, while that's still true to some degree now, because new artists form bands, they start playing, and they didn't exist before. Now they exist. They become popular, right? So that is something that's sort of locked to a time. But it's also the case that all this music, all these artists from the past are still heard now, maybe to a greater degree than they were before. And even by younger generations. And so I think that there's maybe less of that cultural generational effect in terms of music preferences and what's considered popular. And there's, just so much opportunity now for people to find and be exposed to music of all sorts that, they may be attracted to and consume and use in their everyday lives.
Yeah, I mean, probably see it with K-pop nowadays, like it's hard to imagine 100 years ago K-pop being popular in the United States, 70 years ago, 6 years ago, Beatlemania, of course, in the United States. But yeah, it is interesting about you can get any song, almost any song ever created in history in about 5 minutes on your laptop right now. It definitely breaks down barriers between cultures.
Yeah.
Which I think is really cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for being on the podcast. I appreciate it. Everyone, Professor Janata.
Thanks for having me.